Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. So over the past few weeks, the Competition Commission of India has imposed penalties of 1,337 crores and another instance of 936 crores in two antitrust cases against Google. Now, we have with us Anupam Manur to talk about this, and I'm Bharath Reddy. So before we get into this, I'll give you a background about what are these two cases and what CCI has basically done. So the first case is about Google abusing its market dominance in the mobile operating system and Android App Store markets to gain a significant advantage over competitors in other markets. So the CCI has observed that Google entered into multiple agreements with OEMs, which imposed restrictions on what they can or cannot do. Now, one such agreement assures that Google's apps such as Search or YouTube or Chrome, they come pre-installed on Android devices, and there's no option for users to uninstall them. So other agreements ensure that Google search services are exclusive and even prohibit OEMs from offering devices with alternate versions of Android, like fork version of the open source code. Now, if any of the OEMs do not comply with these restrictions, they do not get access to Google's Play Store, which basically makes the smartphone, not very usable. So this was the first case. And the second case was related to Google's Play Store policies, which require developers to mandatorily and exclusively use Google Play billing system for app payments, in-app purchases, and everything else. So now this kind of imposes very hefty service fees, and which is eventually borne by the end user. Now, this is also the reason why Google and Apple, for that matter, are able to impose like a 15 to 30% cut on app developers. And there's no way around this. And so app developers have to comply with these platforms. And overall, the innovation, the choice to the end user, all of these things take a big hit. So now, Anupam, for you, this is like a pet peeve. You like to talk about, platform economics, network effects, abuse of market power. What is your sense of what's going on here and, CCI's verdict on against this?
Thanks, Bharath, for having me on this podcast. Yeah, it seems like we've spoken a lot about this in the last couple of days at Takshashila and with our tech policy students. And so it makes it's really interesting. The developments in this have been interesting for various reasons. We'll get into some of the bits later in terms of change in CCI stance, etc. But just on this, I think it's a fairly clear cut move. There's no real controversy or complexity here. Of course, Google will try to go to the courts and drag this out, etc. But the idea is that you have the Android OS, which is owned by Google, and it's pretty much on every other phone. If I'm not mistaken, 95% of phones in India use Android, or 97%, and only 3% use Apple, right? Or something like that, which is quite, that statistic came as a surprise as well. So that means Google obviously has a massive amount of market power and dominance in that particular market, right? So that is fairly well established, and I don't think even Google will necessarily argue with that, though they are saying, we are facing competitive pressures from Apple and so on, which is really funny. But 3% may not necessarily constitute competitive pressures, but okay, in the future it might be. But as of now, at least, I think that is fairly well established. Now, the second part of it is that what CCI is saying is that it is using its dominant position in the Android market to exploit and to acquire and maintain dominant position in other markets, right? So now they're dominant in Android. They're using that to basically gain market power and maintain market power in the browser market with Chrome. In the video playing, there's some really funny OVHP, okay, which is online video hosting platforms, which is basically YouTube, and then on things like, of course, the Play Store on app stores, right? So at least these three things. There are others, but let's stick to these three because it seems to be the biggest. So one thing that it's obviously doing is that all this bouquet of Google apps that come pre-installed, which includes these three things at least: Google Play Store, Chrome, and YouTube, which cannot be removed. It is the default at the time of installation. right? And that poses significant entry barriers to others, right? So the idea is that because you have, the OEMs, which is basically your mobile manufacturers, have a deal with Google in terms of getting access to Android, and the conditions for getting access to Android is that all of these applications come pre-installed, right? So that basically this shows that there is a dominance in the market, and B, I think it's fairly becoming clear that there is abuse of this dominance in the market, right? So that, which seems to be the criteria for, well, going after tech firm in terms of, like, in comparative terms, right? Which is that to say that, dominance by itself is not bad. So if it was just that Android had 97% of the market, I don't think you could have really made a case. It's something to watch out for. But the fact that that dominance is now being used to create entry barriers in other markets is where it becomes problematic.
So on the come up with a convincing argument, so CCI has to demonstrate dominance in a market and also the abuse of dominance. So when it comes to establishing this dominance in the market, so CCI has gone about defining they have to define what the market is. And when Google claims that Apple is a competitor, so CCI's response was that Apple is in the business of, if I'm getting the phrasing right, Apple's business is about providing an integrated software and hardware ecosystem of multiple devices which work well and provide a seamless experience to the user. Whereas Google is in the market of creating a platform where it acquires users and then monetizes, this large user base to sell ads. So is this an accurate definition of market? And is this distinction that CCI has drawn, is that a valid distinction in your opinion?
That's a really tough one, Bharath. I'm not entirely convinced by CCI's argument here. I mean, for sure, it seems like, they have different business models, but to what I think if you take away all of the jargon, the common sense parlance, the question here is, an iPhone and an Android phone substitutable, and to what degree is it substitutable, right? And if we think they are reasonable substitute for each other, then the market has to be defined at a slightly broader sense. And I think in most of these things, CCI has gone about making narrow market definition, something that we'll discuss later, but they have pretty narrow market definitions, right? And that means that, establishing dominance is fairly easy now. If you just look at, this is the age old question of, how do you define a relevant market? And I think CCI has taken a very sharp kind of definition, right? Very pointed, sharp, and quite narrow kind of definition. And so therefore has excluded kind of Apple and Google as two separate, entities which work in two separate markets. I think that's still up for debate. I would imagine that they're not. Yeah, the business models are surely different in terms of, Apple gives you this entire iPhone plus Mac plus iPad plus this thing plus iOS. That's all supposed to be one thing. Whereas, for example, Google Pixel phone is not as connected to Android OS, right? These are two separate things. So while that may be the case, I would still imagine at those individual levels, they are in a way substitutable, right? An Android phone and an iPhone is substitutable in some sense. So that's up for debate, and I think that can be discussed further. But if you look at the present case on just the two cases that you mentioned, right, the way that they have defined the relevant market is pretty spot on. I mean, it is narrow, it is specific, but it seems to be spot on. So that is at the larger level. What you mentioned about Apple and Google is at the largest level of these two entities, right? But at the narrower terms, in terms of like the three things that we spoke about, right? Android, or four things: Android, Play Store, YouTube, and Chrome. That market definition is pretty clear, right? So they've said, for example, Android is in the market for licensable OS for smart mobile devices in India. It's a fairly good definition, fairly broad, and then you can clearly see Android is probably 99.999%, right? In terms of market power, or market share at least. The second is market for App Store for Android smart mobile OS in India. Now, here's where it gets interesting. So this is where there can be contestation, because there are multiple app stores, by the way, for Android smartphones. Of course, Google's Play Store is the biggest one, but it's not the only one. I mean, Samsung will have its one, Redmi or Xiaomi will have its own Play Store. You'll have Play Stores of different this thing. You might have an independent Play Store, etc. So there is some level of competition. But of course, here is basically the crux of CCI's argument, right? Because the Play Store is the default. It's pre-installed, it's the default. default, you can't remove it, and it's very deeply embedded with the Android operating system. The other competitors in this particular space, which is others which are providing an app store, the tide is against them. That it's not a level playing field, it's unfair to them, etc. Right? So Google, again, just to reiterate, Google is using its dominance in the Android operating system to abuse its power, and abusing its power in another market, which is basically the app store market, right? And the same thing goes for general web search. So Google web search is again default, pre-installed, cannot remove. Then you have web browsers, so non-OS specific web browsers. This is where Chrome comes in, and of course YouTube, right? So in all of this, there is significant competition, or there are other competitors, but again, they don't stand or I won't say they don't stand a chance, but it's very difficult for them because of the abuse of dominance by Google, right? So you can imagine, if you have, I mean, how difficult would it be for, let's say, Brave to get onto an Android phone when there is Chrome already pre-installed, it's a default, etc. Right? And I think that is a non-trivial and quite a significant kind of barrier that Brave would have to overcome in order to compete against Google and Google's Chrome, rather. So that I think is the crux of CCI's argument.
Right, and just a couple of points I noticed while you were talking. So one is on the definition of market power. So if you like, Android might have a 95% plus market share in India, but if you look at other markets, like in the US, I think it might have a 50% market share, and Apple might have a 50% market share. So how you define the market has a very big role in how you establish. Whether you're able to establish dominance in that market, and obviously within the Android ecosystem, the Android Play Store, I mean App Store, has a very, I mean, is probably the most used app store. So that's, and it cannot be substituted by the Apple App Store, is what the CCI observes. So they're not substitutes, because the Google's Play Store only works on Android, and Apple's Play Store, I mean App Store, works only on the iOS ecosystem. So that's one distinction, and how you define the market plays a very big role in how you are able to prove that there is a dominant presence of one player in that market. And yeah, so now as we move on, we see that over the past several years, the CCI has usually taken a hands-off approach to regulating tech platforms. It's not been, and if you look at the past data from say 2011 to 2018, it's not been very effective at collecting the penalties that it has imposed. Some of these stats show that CCI has imposed a cumulative penalty of $1.3 billion, but has recovered less than 1% of this total amount. So what does this change in stance of the CCI, and what do these penalties mean, like these huge penalties? So it seems huge to us, but it still might be, compared to Google's revenues, it might be a very minuscule sum. But what do these penalties mean, and what does this change in stance of CCI indicate?
Right. Two things here. I mean, one is just on the penalties, and the other is the change of stance. And I'll take these up one by one. So, in terms of the change in direction of CCI is very interesting. And if you would allow me to indulge in a little bit of again, history and storytelling, then we have to go back to when CCI was formed, 2003, right, and look at how it's evolved over the years. I'll keep it brief so as to not bore our listeners, but CCI was formed under the shadow of the old kind of competition rules that existed, almost in fear of the old competition rules that existed. So up till 91, you had the MRTP Act, the Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act, which was, as I think many of you would know, was an overbearing, overwhelming law that pretty much killed all of the businesses in its wake. And it was responsible for extremely low growth rates in India and a whole bunch of other things, right? I mean, the MRTP Act was draconian. It was a nightmare to deal with, and it was the ultimate business killer. Now, when in 2003 you had a new set of competition commission, a new law passed, which is the Competition Commission Act, and so on, there was a change. There was a very clear shift. As I said, it was born out of the fear of the MRTP Act. So the new commissioner, the new set of people there, the mandates given, etc., were very different, and they were very watchful. So they didn't go about disturbing and perturbing businesses under the guise of enforcing competition rules, unless they could really prove that there was uncompetitive practices, there were things that was distorting the market, etc. Right? So they took a rather labored approach, and I mean, it was very clear to see that they would rather err on the side of caution. I mean, err on the side of letting things be rather than intervening and causing a lot of damage. And so, in for 15-16 years after its formation, I think CCI took a quite a, I wouldn't say laid back approach, but took a cautious approach in its intervention. So it would follow a set procedure. It would go about trying to define the relevant market. It had to prove that there was dominance in that market. Then it had to prove that there was abuse of dominance in that market. And then it had to, basically apply a fine. And once that fine was applied, of course, there would be, complaints, or what do you say, appeals, etc. And ultimately it would get resolved. It would take a fraction, but there was a signaling mechanism there. So it was quite a laborious process. And CCI didn't, abuse its powers for a long time. Now in 2018 or so, I mean, I don't know exactly it's not like a transition which is very clear to see, but there was a transition in terms of how CCI started approaching this. And you suddenly see a spike in the number of investigations done, right? You can very clearly see a spike post 2018-19, where of the number of investigations it's take, the number of cases it's handling, the fines meted out, the number of times it's found this thing to be guilty, and so on. So that, I think, is a very clear transition that's taken place in CCI's approach. Now, whether this is good or bad, I'll let people decide. I mean, I have my views, but we let people decide. But CCI is now taking a lot more proactive approach, right? Now, part of this is definitely going into a narrower market definition. So one of the things that CCI was always finding it very difficult is when it's dealing with some of these tech companies or any other companies, you'd get lost in this entire debate of what the relevant market is. So as we've said, when you're talking about Uber and Ola, for example, any of us would probably look back and say, Uber and Ola are two players in a cab aggregator market, and therefore have some kind of dominance. Whether there is abuse, we can look at later, but there is some kind of dominance, right? But immediately, I mean, the relevant market definition becomes extremely important, because Uber would claim that the relevant market is just urban transport, which means metro, bus, autos, even walking is a competition to itself, and therefore it has a very small market share. Amazon would say it's in market of retail, and so all of your kirana stores are in fact a competition to Amazon, and so therefore, how can you prove dominance that way? Then, seen in that sense, Amazon would have less than a 2 or 3% market share, right? But if you look at it as just e-commerce, it would have a much bigger market share. So in the same way, I mean, if you look at each one of these things, how you define the market will massively influence how you prove dominance, or how you prove abuse of dominance, and therefore the cases. So until quite recently, CCI would take a rather broad-based definition of the relevant market, and therefore would be a lot more lenient in terms of establishing the relevant market. I think that has also changed in that about the same time frame. And as we mentioned earlier, you can see that the market definitions have gotten a lot more narrow. And if the market definitions have gotten a lot more narrower, then proving dominance becomes a lot more easier, right? So that, I think, is one other big change that's happened. And finally, I know I'm speaking quite a bit, but finally, there's this entire thing about ex ante versus ex post regulation. So again, in its cautious phase, CCI would not move until there is an abuse of dominance. So just because a company or a firm or any particular service is dominant wouldn't necessarily mean that it will result in abuse of dominance or will result in harm, and therefore there was no need for intervention as such, right? So that, and only once there was, let's say, abuse of dominance, once there was harm, you would intervene, you'd you'd put a fine, etc., right? But I think that has also changed in the sense that CCI is being a lot more proactive. It is looking out for potential harm in the future and then acting in order to reduce that potential harm. So we'll leave it at that for the moment. Let's take a break, come back, and discuss whether that's a good or bad thing.
Right. So yeah, welcome back. And so we're talking about CCI's recent verdicts, antitrust verdicts against Google. And now when we look at the big tech companies' perspectives, why do they prefer to have vertical integration? Why do they have these restrictions with OEMs? So they claim that there are some valid reasons for doing these things. So for example, in Google's case, they say that having multiple forks of the Android operating system could lead to fragmentation. So you have multiple different variants of Android, and having all of these different versions of Android would lead to a delay in security updates or feature updates. And so the users would, suffer from not having the up-to-date security or the features that Android, the latest version of Android has. Another reason could be that having a single app store with gatekeeper could keep unreliable or malicious apps out. And without someone like Google playing this gatekeeper role, you might have apps that snoop on what on your. They don't claim to do the things that they claim to do, but try to do a lot of other things as well. And a gatekeeper would be able to monitor these activities and kick out apps that don't comply with what they claim to be doing. And you also could have a situation where OEMs could bundle adware and malware into these essential apps that a smartphone is supposed to have. So it could be a browser, or it could be the Play Store, or any of these essential apps. And a user is then forced to use. I mean, by default, they would use these apps, and they would be giving up a lot of data about themselves to these OEM applications. The basic idea is that a walled garden that Google has created kind of centralizes control and power in the hands of Google, but it also gives you some security and some reliability. It's kind of maybe like you can see it as a trade-off between, do you trust a Chinese OEM with your data, or if they have their own app store and their own browser and all of that, or do you trust Google to take care of all of your data? So it's seen as a trade-off between consolidating it with Google or leaving it open and having more freedom. So, what do you think, Anupam? How do you see this? Do you think there's a case for the concerns that are being raised here, or do you think it's just a reason to accumulate more power and control and vertically integrate multiple verticals into their existing platforms?
Right. These are interesting questions. As in, I think uh, the answer is somewhere in between, right? I mean, obviously, there is some legitimacy in what Google is saying. It is easier for Google to monitor the apps on its own Play Store rather than something else, etc. So, and that makes sense. But I still don't think that's a good enough reason to allow that kind of dominance. And there are two aspects here in my thinking, and there could be many more, but I can come up with two reasons why this doesn't hold. The first one is just in terms of choice. Now, if I want to use, let's say, App Store, which is not of Google, and if I can figure out what the potential risk is, then that's a choice that I'm making, right? So, if, for example, I mean, people make such choices all the time. People make a choice whether to keep their money in a fixed deposit at 6% rate of interest, or buy stocks which can potentially give 15% but downside is zero. They make a choice to keep in small finance bank where the risk is higher, etc., 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 right? So I think people understand risk, people understand returns and risk, and so therefore they can make a choice. So for instance, there is Play Store or an App Store that provides let's say 0% commission, or let's say 5% commission as against Google's 30% commission. And so therefore there is less of that cost being passed on to the consumer. The consumer can take that choice, right? Or can protect himself in another way, or herself in another way, right? Maybe with the amount of money that they save on buying these apps, they can use that money to buy a good security, this thing, I mean, antivirus and some kind of security systems, right? And so all of those options are there, but you'd only know if you allow the market to function. I don't buy this paternalistic attitude of Google saying that it knows what is best and only it can manage all of these things, and all the customers are stupid and they get if you leave them to it, they'll install all forms of malware and this thing. I think that choice is important. There are some people who will definitely who, I think, my parents, for instance, will say, I'd rather pay 30% and have a clean experience where I don't have to worry about the security of my phone. Whereas, let's say you, my good friend Bharath, would say, I don't, I'm a smart chap. I can take care of these things, and I'll go an independent route. So I think that choice is important. Second, I think it's a very flimsy excuse. If you're an operating system or if you're a platform, you can't say that because I cannot guarantee the safety of players on the platform, I will only allow, well, my own players. I don't think that is a good enough excuse. I don't think that holds in any other this thing. So imagine if Uber, essentially, it's the task of Uber in a way, if you look at it, right? It's a task of Uber to maintain safety and security of what happens in the car. They can't say, I mean, they've tried, but it can't work. They can't say, oh, the drivers are independent contractors and they can do whatever the hell they want. If they rob you, it's your risk. They can't. It's their duty to maintain that security. Right. Similarly, I mean, you can take any such thing. If you go to a supermarket, for example, they sell. I mean, a supermarket is a platform. It's an old school platform, and they sell all kinds of stuff in their supermarket. But they can't say, I mean, yeah, this could be poison. It's an unbranded thing. It could be poison, and but it's up to you, right? I can't this thing. Or if you want complete safety, buy only my products. I don't think that's how it works. And you can't get away with that line of reasoning anywhere. And so I think as part of Google's Android operating system, it's their duty to provide security to, well, different kinds of operating systems. So if it means, for instance, securing the apps and, running it through some kind of checks on apps that are downloaded from any Play Store, that's the job of the operating system, not the job of something else. I mean, ultimately, remember this, right? I think a lot of people switched over to Mac because Mac operating system is inherently more stable and more. I'm not paid by Mac, by the way. I just use Mac. I wish I was, but it's inherently just more stable and resilient to external attacks, which Windows is open to, right? So in Windows, you need to download an operating, antivirus, whereas in Mac you might not need to, right? At that level, in just computers, I think operating systems have figured that out. So there's no reason why that can't be the same in mobile phones. Does that make sense, Bharat?
Right. Yeah, I kind of agree. I think there might be a market solution where there might be different app stores which will compete, and some of them might even find a way to balance the security that on one hand and the freedom on the other hand, and also might be able to provide all of these services without charging these exorbitant 15 to 30% fees to the app developers. So that will come out only if you have competition between app stores. And I mean, I'm pretty sure that there might be a solution. I mean, this competition will yield the best outcomes for the end user. Yeah.
And so we imagine, I mean, right now we're still working under the presumption that every other app store will be completely, ridden with malware and it'll be unsafe. That need not be true at all. In fact, if you let the market operate, you will have different kind of app stores which will optimize for different aspects. You could have an app store which can guarantee the same level, if not more, level of safety and security as Google. There's no reason why that's not possible, right? And you can have a mega rating of the app stores as well. People will use different things. They can rate, they can review people. There's shared knowledge, and I think the market will develop that way. It's developed for pretty much every other thing that we know. There's no reason why App Store is so unique or different from other things. It's a platform within a platform, and we've seen this market model many places.
Right. So with that, we come to a close on whatever we've been talking about, and Europe has generally been at the forefront of regulating big tech, and a lot of the restrictions imposed by CCI are kind of on similar lines to those imposed in Europe. Now, it'll be interesting to see how all of these plays out over the coming years, because the Digital Markets Act, which is supposed to come into effect, I think May next year, is expected to bring in a lot of these reforms as well. So it'll be interesting to see how all of this plays out. And any closing comments, Anupam?
Yeah, just trying to tie up all of the different strains, right? One strain was just on whether this new change of CCI is good or bad. Just closing comments on that. My comments, of course, you could have a different view, and it will be equally perfectly valid. But my comment is that regulating ex ante is always dangerous. The potential for harm, there's been a lot of instances in the world where regulating on the potential for harm has gone horribly wrong. India, again, is the best example of that. The entire MRTP Act was based on exactly this, right? That we will not allow Bajaj to grow too big because it can corner the market and then hike prices. And so you never allowed Bajaj to manufacture more than 100 scooters a month. And so you don't want that kind of a scenario. I'm not saying CCI is necessarily going there, but just that line of reasoning is kind of dangerous. I would still prefer that harm is established and then action is taken, and if you do it enough number of times, right, you need credibility. So you do it enough number of times, then eventually, I mean, it will start pinching and hurting your tech companies, bringing to the second point, I think up to the last few years, all of the fines that Europe and India had put on Google, etc., wouldn't pinch it too much. But I think that is changing, Bharat. One, I think the fines are getting bigger, and two, importantly, all of the tech companies, I mean, if anybody is keeping stock of what is happening with the tech companies in the US, all of them have, reported extremely disappointing quarters, and it's projected to be quite bad in the upcoming few years. So, I mean, this is a good time to sell your tech stocks. Maybe this is not investment advice, but tech companies are not projected to do great over the next couple of years, maybe a year or 2 years. Interest rates are hiking, VC money is dried up, all of those things that come into play, right? Which means that these fines will start pinching them. And so, the question about whether this is enough, not enough, I mean, I don't know what the correct number is, but I think it is given that fines across the world on some of the big tech companies will start pinching them, and shareholders will start asking them to act a lot more responsibly in order to avoid the fines. Third, Europe is a good case. It's something to look up to for India, both in terms of what to do and what not to do. What to do in the sense that I think Europe has done well in terms of highlighting the problem quite well. They study these things quite carefully. They release detailed kind of publications on the data and evidence of wrongdoing, and which is great, right? I mean, that is what is required for good this thing. So I think the process of running the competition commission, etc., is really good, and I think that is something that India can look at. So having a research team, for example, looking at where the wrongdoing is happening, I think we are not even catching a lot of the wrongdoing that's happening, right? Increasingly we are, but there's you can do a lot more. And once you, for example, give an order, I think that has to be backed up by meticulous evidence of wrongdoing. You can't just pass an order, right, and give a verbal statement or a judgment. So I think that's where it has to improve. But you take it too far, in order to be this ex ante judgments where you where you try to weed out potential harm in the future, then you'll end up where Europe is, which is that Europe doesn't have a single big tech firm to its name, or the ones that are dying. They're not necessarily the startup capital, or they just struggle because of extremely tough regulation. So you don't want to be in that boat, right? So I think you want to find middle place there, and so that also gives you enough pause for thought.
Thanks, Anupam. This has been an interesting conversation, and thanks everyone for listening in, and see you next time.
Thanks, bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takstashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.